Welcome to this session, and I'm looking forward to sharing some key concepts and strategies around managing unconscious biases. I attended a Train the Trainer session in Los Angeles back in 2017, and I'm excited to share that training with you today. Typically, this happens over a half-day kind of seminar, but I'm going to try to combine everything down into just 1 hour for you today. It's important to know that everyone has unconscious biases. It's a natural attribute of being human, but the good news is that we can enhance our awareness of our biases and learn how to manage them. So I encourage you to engage today in the training session. We can learn from each other. So if you want to share an experience or an example of that you have been involved in, it will enrich our session today. So you can type them into the chat, and I want to thank Dr. Leese for being in the meeting and watching that chat for us. Okay, so you can see here our session outcomes, our takeaways for today's session, learning about our cultural identities, unconscious bias, and then developing strategies to mitigate those. There's several verses on bias and favoritism in the Bible, and it's just really important to know that we're to be respectful of everyone. We are all created in God's image, and there's several verses in the Bible that deal with this. This is just a few. It's what I could fit on the slide. So I wanted to share that with you. And then I also have some resources to gauge unconscious bias. I will share the slide deck with you, and then these links will be live for you, and you can look at those. We'll be talking in just a moment about the implicit bias test and the cultural values profile, and then what your culture is, and awareness and things like that. And then the United States domestic diversity, some information about that as well. So what does this mean? Why is this conversation about culture and cultural values important in our workplace or in our classrooms? Why is it important here at SNU? You can see on this slide that there are several reasons why it's important to all organizations. Today, we work in a very diverse environment. Our classrooms are very diverse, and that's more of a norm than an exception. So people are working on a day-to-day basis with diverse markets and partners out in the business world. And to us, it's our students. They're very diverse. Since my time here at SNU, our student population has changed quite a bit. And we see a lot of diversity in our traditional students and also in our PGS students. So it's really important for all of those reasons that you see listed there on the screen to understand about cultural preferences, and then also our own unconscious biases. So how do you define cultural diversity? What types of cultural diversity do you notice in your work environment, in the offices where you are, or in your classroom? There's numerous characteristics of diversity: race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic, etc. There's more than what's listed here on the screen. And the definition can potentially be very broad and sometimes a little bit overwhelming. But for purpose of this training, I want to narrow the definition down to two aspects. Whoops, excuse me, I went ahead a little bit too quick. So on this next slide, I want to show some images of different individuals, and just think about those. As you look at those, just jot down or just make a mental note of your first impression related to those images. So I'll show the first one. I'll leave it here on the screen for just 2 or 3 seconds. What are your first thoughts when you see this individual on the screen? And I'll go to the second image. There's the third. The fourth. And the fifth. This is the last one. These are images that were shared at my training a few years ago. We each brought our own. So Think about that. What words came to your mind? Your first thoughts on each of those pictures. Did you find yourself making any negative associations with the image that you saw? And if so, why is that? So the point of this exercise is to help us see how easy and tempting it might be to make judgments about others simply based on appearance. So reflecting on what motivated the judgment that you had on that person can be an even more powerful learning experience and help us to unpack some of those unconscious biases. So in my training session for this picture that was shared by one of the participants, the words student, nurse, barista, all were presented. It's not at all who this person actually was, but it was some things that we initially thought of. But, we thought of nurse. Why didn't we think of doctor when we saw a woman on the screen? That type of thing. For this next image, some of the information that was shared just on an initial viewing of this person was perhaps they're unemployed, or they could be homeless by the way they look, just totally judging someone based upon their appearance. And then this one, it was kind of all over the place with this picture. This gentleman's got a very nice smile, looks very friendly, yet he's here with all of this biker dude. Is he a member of a gang? And one person said he wasn't wearing any 1%er patches. I'm not even sure what that is. So he wasn't represented in any of the bad biker gangs or anything like that. But you can see how easy it is to judge someone just by, an initial glimpse at them. For this individual, this is actually the picture that I shared at the training. The first thing, and several people thought this is probably a gang member. Why did they think that? Because that can't be further from the truth. This is Staff Sergeant Jermaine McCullum with Oklahoma City Police Department. He was in my husband's unit for several years, and he's one of my favorite people on the planet. And he really is a victim of unconscious biases. His family kind of sees him as a traitor per se because he went into law enforcement. And then he's dealing with biases of those that he encounters in his job just because he's a Black man. He's told me before, he wonders, why did I go into this line of work? And the reason is he wants to make a difference. But we need good police officers. And I trust me, he is one of the good guys. But people make judgment calls on him just based upon his appearance. And then this next individual is Yasmin Abdel, and I'm hoping I am saying her name correctly. I'm not exactly sure, but she has a TED Talk out that references, what does my headscarf mean to you? And some excerpts in that where she's asking, did you think of her as a mother figure, a refugee, maybe a victim of oppression? Maybe if her husband had forced her to dress that way. But, actually, she's a race car engineer. She designed her own race car and she ran on her university's race team. And she's trained as a boxer. She boxed for 5 years and she's done a lot of different things in her career. And, why would that surprise you? And if it does surprise you that, she's a race car engineer, that she's a boxer, that could be related to unconscious bias, those filters that we use to see the world around us. It doesn't mean that you're racist or sexist. Bias is not an accusation against someone. Rather, bias just needs to be recognized, it needs to be acknowledged, and then it needs to be mitigated. And bias can be about race, it can be about education, social class, disability. We all have biases, and biases about what is different to our own kind of personal social norms. So let's begin with the end in mind. To be effective at the end of the day, organizations need to be diverse, representative of visible diversity and underrepresented groups. Organizations need to be inclusive, an organizational climate where all employees thrive, and they need to be equitable, where all employees are treated fairly. And you could substitute the word employees in there for our students here at SMU. They all need that treatment. And so understanding our biases and enhancing our cultural awareness are the critical first steps in creating a diverse, inclusive, and equitable organization. We need a culturally intelligent workforce and organization. And I want to talk a little bit more about cultural intelligence in a later slide. But understanding our biases and enhancing our cultural awareness are those critical first steps in the process. But again, awareness alone is no guarantee of success in our intercultural interactions. Not only do we need to go beyond awareness and build habits and behaviors that will help mitigate the impact of unconscious biases, we also need to develop our cultural intelligence. So the logical question might be, what is CQ? Well, you can see the definition there on the screen, and it's developed to provide an academically valid way of measuring and developing intercultural performance. It incorporates 4 different capabilities: drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. The drive is one's interest, drive, and confidence to adapt to a multicultural situation. Knowledge is your understanding about how cultures are similar and how they're different. Strategy is your awareness and ability to plan for those multicultural interactions. And then the action is your ability to adapt when relating and working across cultures. So as we consider the relationship between unconscious bias and cultural intelligence, we need to understand that increasing our awareness of our biases helps us to identify and take steps to prevent them from influencing judgments and actions toward others that are based upon those biases. Research proves that awareness, when you couple it with cultural intelligence, helps us form new patterns and new behaviors that will improve our intercultural effectiveness. So our focus today is solely on understanding those cultural values, enhancing our awareness about them, and then identifying potential biases that we may have. So now that we've defined culture, looked at the diversity, let's focus on understanding the values. Our cultural values are like the building blocks of our cultural diversity. They reveal your personal preferences, and they help you understand biases or frustrations that you may have towards those with different orientations. And later in the training, we're going to identify some specific strategies for managing those biases. So what I did in my training a few years ago is I completed a cultural values profile. And I've provided the link to this in that earlier slide in as one of the resources. But there's other ways that you can test this that are available out on the internet to kind of get your values and your preferences. So the purpose of the profile is twofold. It gives feedback on your individual preference, and it allows comparisons with the cultural values of, in this case, 10 global clusters, which are large cultural groupings. And those cultures represent the 10 largest cultural groupings in the world, each of which shares some similar patterns of thinking and behavior. Now, it's important to understand that the 10 clusters that it talks about are by no means an exact or exhaustive grouping of the thousands of cultures that exist across our world. But these groupings provide a helpful starting point, kind of a launching point for understanding differences and similarities between groups of people. So as we walk through the example that I did on my cultural values profile, keep in mind that it's a tool that provides insights on cultural values, and it gives feedback on your personal scores and preferences. And ultimately, those scores and understanding your preferences can help you form an action plan that'll make you more aware of your biases and able to interact effectively in multicultural situations. So this is what it looked like, and the overview of that is that I was given my profile, I was given what the cultural clusters around the world, how they were, and it mapped my personal preferences to each of those cultures. And then it gave me steps to create an action plan to mitigate any unconscious bias that I might have, and steps to become more knowledgeable in the different cultures. So it was based upon, I keep talking about these global clusters. I'm holding up this book here. I don't know if you can see it. It's also there on the screen. Expand Your Borders is the name of the textbook. I've used this in several classes, And it's very helpful in knowing some of the do's and don'ts of certain cultures, ways that cultures prefer to greet one another, conduct business, how they engage in conversation and practices and things like that. So I want to further explain some of those key points. The first 5 cultures are listed there on the slide. Again, they represent the 10 largest cultural groupings in the world, and each of those share some similar patterns of thinking and behavior. Not stereotypes, but just kind of shared preferences regarding their cultural values. And within those global clusters are examples of countries where those clusters can be found, and I've listed those there on the screen. But it's important to remember that all of those typical cautions about stereotyping apply here. You can't categorize the entire world into 10 large groups, but this gives you a launching point for some of the larger groups. Treat these global clusters as kind of sophisticated stereotypes, maybe you could say that, kind of your first best guess about someone from an unfamiliar culture. For example, the US is often described as being very individualistic in our culture, whereas China is often described as being more collectivist in their culture. But not everyone in the US is an individualist, and not everyone in China is a collectivist. So you have to keep that in mind. These are just generalizations about these groups. And in the profile that I completed, I was able to see where my personal orientation scores were compared to each of the other cultural values listed, those 10 groupings, how they compared to that. And I was able to see for all of those different areas, a triangle under each bar graph indicated my self rating based upon the responses to the survey that is incorporated in that study. And it's important to know there's no right or wrong answer. Your rating simply indicates your view of your own cultural value preferences. If you score toward the end of this continuum in one area, that doesn't mean you can't work effectively with someone on the opposite end. And it doesn't mean that if you score in the middle, as I did in some of these, that you can work very easily with people on both ends of the spectrum. It's really important to just understand where you fall and know some of those preferences and what those values mean, and so that your interactions with others can be very respectful, and it can help to mitigate some of the biases that you might have. All right, so now let's talk about these different values. The first one is individualism versus collectivism. And individualists emphasize individual goals, individual rights. As I mentioned, the US is very individualistic, whereas China was a collectivist. They emphasize groups and personal relationships. The next category is power distance. Low power distance emphasize equality and shared decision-making, and individuals with high power distance emphasize differences in status and expect superiors to make decisions. People with a low power distance may be perceived as disrespectful or weak leaders. In contrast, people with a high power distance may be perceived as, dictatorial in their leadership practices. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. It's just their personal preference. Low uncertainty avoidance emphasizes flexibility and adaptability. Someone with that value may be perceived as being underprepared or disorganized. High uncertainty avoidance emphasizes planning and predictability. A person with that orientation could be perceived as being uptight or inflexible. That could be some biases that come out related to those groups. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're right, probably not, but some things that could result. Okay, the next value is cooperative versus competitive. Individuals who are cooperative emphasize collaboration, nurturing, family. Individuals who are competitive obviously emphasize competition, assertiveness, achievement. Someone who's cooperative may be perceived as weak, whereas someone who is competitive might be perceived as combative, and likely that may not be the case. Time orientation, short term emphasizes immediate outcomes like success now. We want, in the United States, we're very much this type of culture. We like things instantly, which other cultures may perceive as kind of being short-sighted. Long-term emphasizes more long-term planning, success later. And, that could be perceived as some as being, really kind of just idealistic. Context is the next value, and direct or low context individuals emphasize explicit communication using words. And sometimes they can be perceived as being very blunt, very rude, very direct. Indirect or high context individuals emphasize indirect communication. So sometimes that nonverbal communication, the tone of their communication, and they can be perceived sometimes as being unclear. Cultural differences around direct and indirect communication is one of the more evident reasons behind some of the most significant conflicts that exist on teams and in the workplace, or maybe even in the classroom. Direct communicators believe that they're being upfront and respectful by, just kind of quote unquote saying it like it is. Whereas someone with indirect communication, they believe they're being respectful by, not insulting one another and not pointing out, what's blatantly obvious. Being versus doing. Individuals with being orientation emphasize quality of life, while individuals with doing orientation emphasize busyness and meeting goals and expectations. Those with being orientation may be perceived as lazy. And the doers, those with doing values, may be perceived as workaholics. In the U.S. Domestic Diversity resource that I shared on slide 3, that resource goes a little bit further and talks about some additional values. The first of those being universalism versus particularism. Universalism emphasizes rules, standards that apply to everyone. Particularism emphasizes specific, unique standards based upon relationships. Neutral versus affective orientation. A neutral will give emphasis on non-emotional communication and hide feelings, whereas individuals with affective orientation give emphasis on expressive types of communication and sharing feelings. Monochronic and polychronic. Monochronic individuals emphasize doing one thing at a time. They'll be particular about punctuality. Individuals with polychronic orientation will give emphasis to fulfilling multiple obligations at a point in time. They're comfortable with interruptions and often find it difficult to stick to timeliness. So of the cultural values, when you get your scores on those, what does it mean? It's good to do it as a work group, so as maybe in an office environment, or even as the university as a whole could do this. And you would group your individual scores in the different areas, and then group the your coworkers or others that are a part of your team as well, and you can see where the differences lie. So it's important to know, the values that other people hold and compared to the values that you hold, and know how to work effectively across any barriers that might come into place. It's really important to avoid negative stereotypes with these different values, and move as quickly as possible to get to know an individual in their own right, rather than in light of a broad generalization. So we're going to learn how to do all of this in the next section of our program today. So looking at the U.S. domestic clusters, this is what's there, and I've shared that with you. You'll see that it provides insights on 5 of the largest and fastest growing cultural groups in the United States today. It's the Caucasian group, the Hispanic Latino, African American, Asian American, and Native American groups. It's important again to note that all of the qualifiers noted for the global clusters apply here too. They're generalizations, and not every individual is going to fit precisely into what their grouping may be. And so what do we take away from this, from these cultural value ratings and what our responses are? They really just show our general orientation to life, to work, to our relationships, our preferences, and how we like to get things done. But they may help understand conflicts that you have experienced in the past with others, or may help you avoid conflicts in the future, because they can shine a light on potential unconscious biases. And then they can help you understand why you and most other people subconsciously prefer interacting with people who have cultural value orientations that are similar to your own. So your cultural value scores do not evaluate whether you can effectively work with others who have a different orientation from you, but they can, like I said, shed some light on that and help you adapt your style when working from people from a different cultural orientation or preference than what you have. So be open to changing, your mental modules and assumptions about one another. So now let's turn to unpacking unconscious bias. And we'll start by defining what that is, but I want you to watch a short video clip first. This is one that we watched in my training there. Let's see if I can get that to play.
Tamara, is there sound with this video?
Not really sound, no.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that video was an experiment, advertising experiment that was conducted over in Europe. The subject of the experiment were couples who had gone for a movie, and they walk into that very crowded theater with only 2 seats available. You notice some couples, despite having a ticket, decided to leave. What potential biases may have caused them to make the decision to leave? In some cases, it might be like we identified some of those individuals before, maybe as the biker dude, or maybe they saw this as a potentially unsafe situation. So why is that? If you were one of the subjects in the experiment, if you had 2 movie tickets, what do you think you would have done? Would you have left or stayed? Is it possible that some biases that you might have, some unconscious biases, might have caused you to leave that situation? Bias shows up everywhere. There's no shortage of data to kind of further drive home that point. Numerous research studies reveal various biases we have towards others who may be different from us. And I'm going to highlight a few of them in these next slides. We often remember or get influenced more by how something was said rather than by what was actually said. Have you noticed different accents across different parts of the United States as you travel? Probably so. Do you think people are perceived differently because of their accent? They are. A researcher by the name of Jennifer Kramer with the University of Kentucky showed exactly that with some research that she conducted. It revealed that 2 out of 5, or 40% of Americans, associated a Southern accent with being uneducated. So is that true? No, it's just, it reveals some of the unconscious bias that those participants had related to someone with a Southern accent. Okay, this was a real life example that was shown at the training that I went through that had happened to one of the training participants. And you can read there on the slide. And am I racist? Yesterday, when I was stopped to get my blood drawn, a Black man walked in. I just assumed he was the lab tech. Only later did it become evident he's a physician. Why did I so quickly assume he must be the lab tech? If he had been a white guy, I probably would have guessed he was a doctor. This was something shared at my training session. And this is a case of race bias. What makes this narrative even more interesting is the fact that this person who said this was also Black. You can have racial biases toward your own race. And that was something that I learned there at the training. Similar stereotyping is also done with other forms of diversity. For example, as I mentioned earlier, many people associate nurse with being female as opposed to male, doctors with being male as opposed to female. Those types of biases can have multiple implications in the workplace or in our classroom. It can influence an individual's chance in a job interview or promotion. It can affect how we interact with our students in the classroom. So it's really important to understand these. Another item that was presented is that research has shown men tend to get paid more than women at equal jobs. We've heard that before, and even among women, there's sometimes attributes that help them get paid more than others. You might guess what that is. A research study by a Professor Johnston at the University of Queensland concluded that blonde women in his study were paid 7% more than brunettes in the workplace. Interestingly, many of these organizations or institutions weren't even aware that that was the case. Maybe that was related to unconscious bias. One of the largest and most well-known studies on unconscious bias was conducted at MIT and the University of Chicago. It's known as the resume study. And it concluded that applicants with typically white names received 50% more callbacks for interviews than those applicants with typically Black names. Further, the white candidates in general received higher callbacks than highly qualified Black candidates. Some of them didn't even have the qualifications that the Black candidates had. Similar studies that have been done in other countries have also shown linkages between race and interview callback rates. And it's just important to keep that in mind. These unconscious biases can have a very negative impact on individuals, particularly those who are part of groups that have visible diversity, like it's, skin color, gender, that type of thing, appearance, or those from underrepresented populations. So it's important for everyone to understand that we all have our own biases. Medical research in the field of unconscious bias has revealed that bias is found in the same region in the brain that's associated with fear and threat. So when thinking about unconscious biases, the question to ask is not, am I biased, but rather, what are they? Acknowledging and understanding them is really the first step toward addressing them. Here's the definition of unconscious bias there on the screen. And you can see that these are activated involuntarily without our awareness, our intentional control. They're implicit and different from explicit biases. And these implicit biases, they're rooted deep in our subconscious mind, and therefore they're difficult to assess. So one of the fundamental errors that we make while reading a situation or an individual is judging too quickly. Just like the example I showed in those 5 images before, maybe you were quick to judge those individuals based upon their appearance. When we judge too quickly, we end up relying more on our automatic responses than deliberate ones. Those automatic responses are often influenced by unconscious bias. This video, I think I have to click watch on YouTube.
How much did they ask you? Well, that's a lot of money for a deck.
Can you hear that, Lynn?
Well, I hate to tell you this, but you're getting robbed.
Yes.
Did you hear me? You're getting robbed.
AmeriQuest, an open-minded, equal opportunity lender.
Look at the cute dog.
So those videos are kind of funny and they provide humor. They make it at the point, though, that when incomplete information is available, we sometimes piece it together quickly by adding our own judgment and interpretation. So let me see if I can get, okay. All right, so research over the years has helped to establish some consistent characteristics of unconscious bias. It's pervasive and robust, Everyone has them. It doesn't necessarily align with our declared beliefs. We just gave the example, or some of the examples that you saw there may have helped you with that. And then there's the natural tendency to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. And then these unconscious biases have real-world effects on our behavior. They're malleable and they can be unlearned. But unlearning requires some focused effort and conscious practice. Consequences of unconscious bias in an organizational context impact all of those different areas, our intercultural effectiveness, our talent acquisition, and maybe that's retaining employees, maybe that's retaining students could be included in that as well. Employee development and promotional opportunities, and then also creativity and innovation within an organization. There are at least 150 identified cognitive biases. For the purpose of this training, we're going to focus on 4 types of unconscious biases that are the most commonly found in the workplace. Or you could substitute for our classrooms. The first one is an affinity bias, and that's the tendency to warm up to people who are just like us. We tend to get along better with people that share those same values that we have. And we can also relate this to an in-group bias talked about earlier. So, what's the implications of affinity bias in the workplace through this? There's a case there entitled The Interview. I'm not going to take the time today to go into that, but you can see how affinity bias really plays into this interview process and hiring and promoting of individuals within a certain organization. And you can look at that later. I'll share the slide deck with you. But think about that. Where could affinity bias be a problem in the work environment or in the classroom? Maybe it comes into play in job interviews. Maybe it comes into play with favoritism in the classroom. Confirmation bias is the second type, and that's the tendency for people to seek information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. In this type of situation, we may even ignore or devalue information or evidence that breaks those assumptions that we have. Okay, let's assume that you have a bias against female drivers. And then the moment you notice a female driver creating, a traffic jam or taking a wrong turn, you take that information and it strengthens your bias further, that confirmation bias. But at the same time, you may not notice, several female drivers around you who are doing a great job. That's just one example of confirmation bias. So think about that. Look at this picture. Imagine that you have an ingrained unconscious belief that young Hispanic men with their cultural values are viewed as lazy. Very untrue. that stereotype is very untrue, but based on values, sometimes that is the way that they are perceived, then, how would you manage a young Hispanic man who reports to you in the work environment? Or if you had a young Hispanic man in your class, what actions would you take with that individual? Would you be more or less likely to invest in developing him? Would you be more or less likely to put more complicated assignments on that person? And when that person made a mistake, would you be more or less likely to accept an explanation for that? These are good things to ponder. The next one is the halo effect. And in the case of the halo effect, we make judgments about people based on an overall positive impression that we have about them. That can lead to workplace behavior such as being more lenient with some employees or being more lenient with students because of your overall positive impression of that person. It can also be true in cases of negative impressions. That is called the devil effect. It's the exact opposite of the halo effect. So maybe you're lenient with some students and not with others. Do you bend the rules for some employees and not for others? It might be because of an unconscious bias known as the halo effect or the devil effect, the opposite of that. And then perception bias. That's the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that make it impossible to make an objective judgment about members of the group. The media really provides us ample examples of this bias. A study by Pew Research Institute showed that although illegal immigrants come to the US from all parts of the world, Asia, Canada, Europe, Mexico, a lot of different places, because of how the media reports on the issue, Hispanics are by far the group that's singled out most often and referenced in stories about immigration. And some may assume that illegal immigration is a problem exclusive to that culture, making it difficult to convince people otherwise. These perceptions about certain groups can also play out within an organization. It can influence a person's chance of being considered for a job or being given a raise, or maybe even just being included within the workplace or in group assignments. So think about that, how that could play out in the classroom. Do you have that type of bias, maybe when it comes to athletes, or maybe related to different genders, perceptions about different genders and that type of thing? These types of biases can definitely play out in the classroom, and we need to be aware of them. Okay, this is a short video. What does a pilot look like? And there's 10 little girls that were asked that question, and you can see their responses here. They all drew men. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that they immediately thought of a pilot as a man? There might be some unconscious bias that's instilled in them at a very young age that they're not aware of. The implicit association test is one tool that can help to point out unconscious biases that you might have. I've put the link at the top of the slide deck, and I hope you take the opportunity to complete a few of those tests and review your results in light of potential unconscious biases that you might have. So it's important to kind of understand that measurement and the tool in more detail. It's a computerized test, and it was designed back in 1998 by individuals at Harvard. It's an academically validated tool. And as you would have noticed, the implicit biases across a broad range of characteristics we've talked about already: race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, religion. And there's other areas as well that this implicit bias testing relates to. The IAT examines our positive or negative associations with different patterns of words and images and that type of thing. And therefore, it can point out some potential implicit biases that you might have. The racial IAT asks you to categorize like Black and white faces respectively and match them with either good words versus bad words. And how you match those, or your tendencies in that application, can help to identify biases. Here's an example of another IAT test. This was on gender. So on this slide, there's a list of words associated with gender: boy, girl, father, mother, etc. And the second part of the gender test included a list of subjects where some are pure sciences and some are related to liberal arts. And then as part of the test, you are expected to categorize, first of all, female with liberal arts and male with science. And then in the second half of the test, you were to do just the opposite: male with liberal arts and female with sciences. And how quickly you're able to link those things indicates any potential bias that you might have. And so looking at the average score of the people who have taken that particular test, 75% associate male with science and female with liberal arts. Makes you wonder, why that might be the case. So those IAT scores, they expose, like I said, potential biases that you may have towards certain groups of people. They will also help to increase your awareness and enable you to be more conscious when interacting with individuals within different groups. And they help you hold yourself and others accountable for patterns of thinking that may negatively impact others. It helps you to raise awareness about biases. So it's interesting. I encourage you to take some of those tests. Okay, awareness about unconscious bias is an important stepping stone. Similar to cultural intelligence, unconscious bias, they're malleable. You can change them. You can unlearn them. So once you become aware that you and maybe others around you have these biases, you can then take necessary steps to prevent yourself from making judgments and engaging in actions that are based on those biases. So you need to identify behaviors and implement habits that will help you to break biases. It's exactly what we're going to be discussing in this section on building habits. As noted throughout the training, unconscious bias is something we all have. I'm sure you've come across situations in the work environment, maybe at home, maybe in the grocery store, in a meeting, where you notice some seemingly little acts of disrespect or discrimination. Those are subtle but annoying phrases or acts. It could be something as subtle as being mistaken for someone else from your own race, or not being introduced in a meeting, or someone checking an email while they're talking to you. Or maybe you've heard, "You've done a great job on that report. I didn't expect it would be this good." That could be another example of a microaggression. Those messages, they're subtle, semi-conscious, but they're devaluing, and we send those out. They can lead to imbalances or inequities in our relationships and in our work with others. If continually practiced, these aggressions can turn into microaggressions. And so we're going to look at some more examples at work on the next few slides. And these were actual examples that had occurred to people that were part of my initial training for in this a few years ago. A Black employee is commented as being articulate and bright. Why would it surprise anyone that a Black person is articulate? What was the hidden message behind that phrase that was given to one of my counterparts in the training? What do you think that could be? Was it posed by an unconscious bias? Here's another one. This was to a third-generation Asian American. She was complimented for speaking good English at our conference, at the training for this. So what's the hidden message behind that? Maybe, that she doesn't belong here, she doesn't fit in or assimilate or act or, talk like us, when she's a third generation American. So it was very much a teachable moment in that situation. And then another one was a female physician wearing a stethoscope was mistaken by others for a nurse. So again, the hidden message there: doctors are mostly male and nurses are mostly female. that is an unconscious bias that, we need to examine and really think about. So refer back to the What's Your Culture. That's a job aid that I made available to you. And when you complete that, you can look at how your values impact maybe microaggressions in an organization and what impact that could have on your intercultural interactions. It's important to be aware of your own implicit biases and develop ways to mitigate them. It's okay and even important to have your own set of values. We all do, but they should not negatively impact others who are different from us. And so a framework that kind of helps to build habits to break these biases is established here. This was developed by Dr. Patricia Devine from the University of Wisconsin. It's about intention, attention, and time. So intention is acknowledging that you have unconscious biases, and then you have the motivation to change those. And then attention is giving attention when stereotypical responses or assumptions are activated. People need to know when biased responses are likely to occur. So you pay attention to your interactions. And then time, you give yourself a space to practice strategies to break those automatic associations and replace biased responses with responses that are more consistent with your goals and more inclusive. And so before discussing some strategies, let's kind of look at how microaggressions and microaffirmations could play into that. So we've talked about microaggressions, and they may be seemingly harmless messages, but they devaluate individuals. And it's said that we send approximately 2,000 to 4,000 micro messages every day. And research has shown that in a 1-minute conversation, you can have around 40 to 50 micro messages being sent back and forth to one another. Are they microaggressions or are they micro affirmations? It's important to make sure that you're affirming one another. For breaking biases, our focus needs to be on improving our micro affirmation behavior and reducing those aggressions. So examples of micro affirmation behaviors in the workplace or in the classroom: greet individuals and colleagues, customers with sincerity, create positive impact. It's critical to really be sincere and genuine with each other. Connect person to person, bring a personal element to your interactions, and acknowledge each employee or student beyond the role or position that they occupy. Take an interest in who they are as an individual. Wishing someone a good day, asking about their well-being, or just small ways to, kind of connect with each other. And then be present to the other person. Focus your complete attention on them when they're speaking. Let your body language, your facial expression demonstrate that you are really listening and you are engaged in what they're saying. These are affirming behaviors that they can spread from one person to another and create additional micro affirmations. Some more: respond to what's being said by paraphrasing and empathizing with that person, listening attentively. Appreciate and praise strengths and contributions of your coworkers or students in the class. Give credit for good work that's done, and recognize people for the work they've done. But it's important to be very cognizant and consider those examples within the context of the culture and the cultural values. Some culture may not enjoy receiving a lot of lavish praise. That may be offensive in some cultures, so it's important to understand that. And then another resource that I shared with you is a job aid, kind of habits for breaking unconscious bias, intention, attention, and time framework for a management habit. But we could also develop this for a classroom, and we can practice micro affirmations related to these elements that are shared there with you. Okay. The if-then scenarios are a great way to process and practice how to respond to these cross-cultural situations where people may exhibit biases. So here's 2 real-life scenarios that we talked about in my training. The first one: if you're working on a project with a diverse work team, language and communication are a challenge. with a few of the individuals and you're under a very tight schedule and fearful that you're not going to meet the deadline, and you're tempted to replace them on the project. What cultural factors would be at play there? I mean, how would that leadership style of changing someone really impact the group? And, what are some ways that you could deal with that to mitigate bias and deal with that situation? Here's another one. A manager asked for advice because he seemed to be rude and always making unfair assumptions about others. Seems that he's given to tirades, harsh words, cutting criticisms. His bullying is reported by certain underrepresented groups to be especially uncomfortable. It is known that members of those groups do not thrive under his leadership. This was an actual scenario, like I said, that was brought to our group. So in this second situation, you could maybe ask him, why do you think you're being viewed as rude? Or, even more so with the underrepresented groups, what are some of the things? Maybe body language could come into play there. And it might be the different cultural values at play, the way he's being perceived based upon cultural values. Some of the team members are from a low context, for instance, that we talked about a minute ago, and some are from a high power distance. They really might struggle with his leadership style. So you've really got to unpack those types of things and understand what might be causing the situation or the issues there, and think of some bias busting ways to deal with that type of situation. So now it's time for your so what. We've identified, maybe you have identified maybe potential biases that you have, or you can take that test to maybe identify some that you have. You know what your preferences are. What are maybe some workplace scenarios or classroom scenarios that you have been involved in that you need to create for your own scenario and practice bias busting ways to deal with those types of situations should they occur going forward. Okay, we've come to the final part of the training. We've looked at 2 critical steps for engaging with individuals from different cultural backgrounds, enhancing, first of all, our own cultural awareness and addressing our unconscious biases. However, as I stated at the beginning, this awareness or training does not necessarily guarantee success. The important question is, what's next? Each of us need to develop action steps to become more aware of and to minimize our unconscious biases. And we need to ensure that our biases don't negatively influence our judgment about others. We shouldn't be too quick to judge other individuals. And so the training that I have, I was given information and a development plan and an action plan that kind of answered those questions. So you can think about that. Interculturally, what are challenges that you're currently facing? Maybe that's in the work environment or in the classroom. What opportunities do you want to pursue? What strengths do you currently possess? And what awareness areas would you like to improve? And when you kind of answer those questions, you can put together an action plan based upon your personal cultural preferences, the potential biases that you maybe have identified, and then identify ways to improve your effectiveness in dealing in intercultural situations. And as you process this, think about everybody that you interact with on a regular basis and identify maybe potential cultural values that are different from what you have compared to what that other individuals have. So suppose you work with Gen Z, or a large percentage of individuals within the Latinx community. As you can see, there are 2 different examples on this slide. What could you do in those types of instances to be a little bit more flexible with Gen Z, or less structured, to give them space to be creative and take risk? In dealing with the Latinx community, that they have the high value for family and how that impacts their decisions. You need to keep that in mind when you're discussing their needs, and give them adequate time to consult family regarding any major decisions that they would need to make regarding their job, or maybe even their, academic schedule or things like that. And then now that you become aware of your own cultural values and the cultural values that others might have, The next important step is to assess and develop your cultural intelligence. I mentioned that earlier. It's known as CQ. It predicts how you'll relate, adapt, and work in culturally diverse situations, and it predicts your capability to perform. So you need to have that drive, that knowledge, the strategy, and then just be ready to perform the actions and adapt when relating to others. Here are some resources that I have used in classrooms and driven by difference text in HR classes and in management courses. The Expand Your Borders, that's used every semester in my communication classes. It's also has been used in the BSBA communication courses because it really does help you understand preferences of other cultural groups. And I wanted to share those with you. And I want to thank you. I know our time is kind of close to an end. But if there's questions or comments, you can always email me. I'd love to meet with you to discuss some of the training that I've had in more detail. Again, this is typically a half-day seminar. I've packed into just an hour, but I'd be happy to share some of the resources with you as well.